So let's start with, who was Joel Bastow? He was a storyteller. One of the emails I got from a former colleague noted he always had a story, usually a long one. He had a lifetime of stories to tell, and if you let him, you could spend your lifetime listening to him. I have proof of that. The 5 or so hours of interviews I have with him probably takes us past his first birthday. Maybe hearing the same story for the 100th time was tiring, but I know people who maybe only met him once or twice at one of our barbecues and would tell me what a great storyteller he was. I watched him hold court. He was a preacher's kid, and not in a good way. Being a preacher's kid meant people thought the best of him, and he took every advantage of it. He hid a dead snake between the door and the screen door, scaring his Aunt Jenny half to death and getting his brother blamed for it. In elementary school, while the teacher wasn't looking, he whaled a school bully in the back of the head with a rock. When the teacher came out to see the bully having Joel in a headlock, it was the bully who had to stay after school. In college, with apparently little better to do, he started making and selling smoke bombs that could be lit and slid under a dorm room door. He boosted sales by setting a few off himself and then blaming others, thus pitting his classmates against each other, who would proceed to buy more bombs from him for revenge. He managed to shut down the power at Delta Tau Delta fraternity across the street after littering the basement stairs with empty bottles and cans. Apparently, someone who experienced that was mad at him 30 years later. He also took the ring out of their bell by lighting a fire underneath. It didn't destroy the bell, but at the next football game, it didn't so much ring as make an unsatisfying clunk. He was from a different time, even the time he lived in. He always spoke as if he grew up like Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn, this magical feral childhood where after school he would go off into the woods exploring with his father's guide dog for hours on end. With a blind father and a working mother, there was really no one around to keep an eye on him. Growing up, the first house he lived in had no running water. He had an ice box for most of his childhood, literally a box that held a block of ice that was delivered once or twice a week by the iceman to keep their food cold. He attended a one-room elementary school that also had no running water and had a pot-bellied stove for heat and a two-holer for, well, whatever a two-holer is for. I remember one of the times when he was visiting the home school, someone asked him if he rode there on a horse. He actually did take a school bus. He was a father. What can I say? He could be embarrassing as hell, but he was my dad. Or maybe that was because he was my dad, and I've had some success in keeping up to tradition. But he would load up the VW Squareback with Jeff and me and a bunch of our school friends, one or two in the way back and no one wearing a seatbelt, and take us into DC to the Smithsonian. And in England, he loaded up the car and he took me and Jeff and a bunch of our friends up to Burnham Rocks or Fountains Abbey or Newby Hall or Scarborough when there was a storm raging out in the North Sea. He was a son. He talked about his dad being his best friend. He actually took his blind dad ice skating on some sometimes sketchy ponds. His dad could follow him by the sound of his skates, and they would also go out and ride bicycles together. He would put cards into spokes to make noise his dad could follow. But he also talks about being treated like a surrogate son by his Uncle John and Aunt Olive and Aunt Jenny and Uncle Frank, at times living with them, but also just spending a lot of family time together. He was a lover of ancestry and family history. He loved his ancestral heritage, not in the way many people would. It wasn't about the rich or famous or distinguished. He mostly spoke of his not of his well-to-do and upstanding Allen ancestors, but of Holdsworth Bastow, who grew up who in his youth pushed a coal cart in the mines of New Pugsley outside of Leeds in North Yorkshire. As I heard it, upon learning that his future mother-in-law was a daughter of the American Revolution, his mother, my grandmother Gladys, decided to one-up her and become a daughter of the Mayflower colony, to which she was entitled due to her Allen ancestry. However, upon finding out that our Mayflower ancestors were in fact America's first white-collar criminals and were deported from the colony after apparently cheating both sides of the transatlantic trade, she never spoke of it again. And my dad never stopped speaking of it. He was a bit of a cheapskate when it came to himself. Let me clarify. He wanted value for money. He didn't want to pay for anything he didn't need. He was an avid reader of Consumer Reports and lived by their recommendations. He would special order cars dutifully researched and recommended by Consumer Reports with no options, no cassette deck, no radio, no AC. He would then proceed to drive them into the ground. I recall in one car, he eventually removed the passenger seat option. He loved his collection of $1 thrift store baseball caps, and he loved shopping at the dollar store. He and Lee would compete to see who could get the cheapest gas. I know when we would travel back and forth between Maryland and Massachusetts that he made every effort to fill up the tank in New Jersey. But he was generous to others. He often offered and never hesitated to pick up the dinner check, no matter how big. He generously gave time and money to honor Ripon's hornblowers and to restore North Attleboro's home school. He gave a great deal of his time to Ripon's scouts. He helped the UU build a new church in Delaware. A few years ago, he covered the cost of flying his whole family out to the UK for a big family trip. He helped with his he helped his grandniece make her way through college, and he always remembered everyone's birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas, Valentine's, whatever holiday it happened to be. He was a showman. When he wanted to get my mom a piano for her birthday, he couldn't just pick one out. So, out. He couldn't just pick one out. He surprised her by having two delivered and letting her pick. While living in England, he surprised my mom with a renewing of their vows in the Ripon Cathedral. He convinced her that they were just going out to dinner, but had conspired with the Old Deanery restaurant and the deacon of the cathedral into making a whole event. When he proposed to Lee, it couldn't just be a simple getting on one knee and asking. It was a whole event with all their friends and family. And I'm sure no one who participated over the years will forget his suit as he presided over extreme croquet. He was a husband. He was a wonderful, wonderful husband to my mother. I mean, they could have one hell of an argument, but at the end of the day, they always worked it out. Once they went from one car to two, he would actually get one for her that had options. When my mom got sick, he took care of her in ways I think we can all only hope that we are capable of. And when she died, he was lost for some time until he met Lee and got a second lease on life. I won't speak for Lee. I think he may have needed her more than she needed him, but I know he loved her very much to the very end, and no amount of time they could spend together would have been too much for him. He was a bad driver. And I'm being a little unfair with this video. This is the only one I could find. He didn't actually drive a Debenhams truck over the hill next to our house, but had he been the driver. So he wasn't just a bad driver, he was a terrible driver, but he had no fear, and it was never his fault. It started soon after he got his license, which he got without the glasses stipulation because he had some quack optometrist who convinced him he could exercise his eyes from 2400 vision to 2020. He apparently squinted, exercised his way through the Mass State Eye Exam. And not long after being issued his license, glasses free, took a right turn a little too early and proceeded to drive across someone's front lawn. He told of when moving to Maryland, he hitched up a U-Haul trailer to his VW Bug. Apparently it was slightly too overloaded with books for the Bug's brakes, and on a particular downhill with a major intersection at the bottom displaying a red light, was unable to stop. That time he made it through without damage. Two of his Ripon Scout friends have told me of their terror of driving with him. One time entering the A1 from an off-ramp and starting to head southbound on the northbound side. My brother recalls a similar thing happening when we were kids over here, so it can't be blamed solely on driving on the other side of the road. And on the way to work one day in England, he hit a spot of black ice and managed to land the car on top of a hedge. I think it may have taken a crane to extricate it. Maybe this one. It never really got any better. He was a traveler, an explorer, and adventurer. Not having not traveled any further than Boston or Providence as a child, he took to travel with unrivaled enthusiasm, beginning when the Army started shipping him around, first to Monterey, then Shimya, then to Maryland. When I was 4 or 5, we drove to Florida to watch a space launch, where he also decided it'd be a good idea to poke a wild alligator along the side of the road with a stick. When we moved to California in the 70s, we drove across the country in an overloaded Volkswagen Squareback. And I kind of recall visiting every national park attraction along the way. When he moved back 18 months later, he and my mom drove back together and did the same. While in California, he took us to Yosemite, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon. He took us to see the giant redwoods. He took us to San Francisco and Mexico. And that may have been just the first 4 months. He also took us to Disneyland. While living in England, we took road trips every year, going up and down the island and to Ireland, and several times across the Channel or the North Sea to the continent. Upon finally being sent home from England after 7 years, he couldn't just take the boring government-sponsored Pan Am flight. He took us on the QE2, along with 12 pieces of luggage, our cat, and our car. In his earlier years, he took a bus to his Army posting at Monterey Language School, stopping it to take a swim in the Great Salt Lake. Even in elementary school, he was an explorer. He managed to convince the teacher to have him lead the whole class to Attleborough's Angletree Stone. Little did she know that he was leading her and a group of first through fourth graders a good 3 or so miles through the woods each way. On his round the world trip for the NSA, he went swimming alone in the ocean on Wake Island, only to be told afterwards about the poisonous stonefish that inhabit the waters. On the flight to Tokyo, he got to fly in a nearly empty 747 where the crew outnumbered the passengers. And while flying through Delhi, he swapped his rubber change purse for a small carved wooden bridge containing several miniature hand carved ivory elephants. He always wanted to skydive, though he never did. I'm guessing Mom nixed that. But he did bend backwards, high up over the edge of a castle wall, and kiss the Blarney Stone. He went hot air ballooning. I think he may have taken a ride on a glider. He once took my brother and I on a search for the Loch Ness Monster. He rented a rowboat and proceeded to row us down the loch, apparently downwind, as when he decided it was time to turn around and head back, he realized there was quite a bit of a headwind, and it took all his strength to get us back. And the best we got was seeing the Loch Ness Monster floating by, which gets to something he wasn't. He wasn't a boater, but he desperately wanted to be. And despite everyone's reservations, he tried, going so far as to rent dock space in Millsboro for his dinghy. This too extended to his childhood, where he tells of finding a small rubber tub in a nearby field, and put it in the full drainage ditch along the train tracks near his house. He went to show off his new boat to his Uncle Frank and proceeded to tip it over, promptly dumping himself into a couple of feet of muddy water. I recall something similar happening on the Indian River 60 or so years later. He was a follower of science and technology. He won the third prize in the Mass State Science Fair. He got a full ride to MIT, which his mother rejected and sent him to Wesleyan instead. He always wanted the latest gadgets, and often ones that didn't exist yet. When he finally bought a car with all the options, it was a Prius, which to him was not so much a car as a large moving gadget. He loved Elon Musk. His favorite non-$1 hat was his Boring Company hat. He desperately wanted to see self-driving cars in his lifetime. We all did. And of course, he was a hornblower. I think this was probably the pinnacle of his existence. What other opportunity could he have to stand up and tell a story to a new group of people every single night, as well as uphold an ancient tradition, get himself on TV, and get himself in newspapers around the world? There's so much more I could say about him, but I think I'll just leave you with this. What he mostly believed in doing and what motivated what he did was to make the world a better place. And in his sometimes uniquely Joel way, to make the people around him the best they could be.